Okay, welcome everyone to Daf Yomi Pesachim, 1 week at a time. Today, this is our 10th lesson, and we will be reviewing Daf 60 through 66. We will be finishing a chapter and starting a chapter. For those of you who have not learned about the sacrifice, about the work that was done in the temple. So I would imagine that these this week and last week have been maybe a little challenging. So I hope to relieve some of that challenge and shed some light, I think, on some of the beautiful things that we learned this past week. And hopefully alleviate some of the complexities, or at least try to understand them. Okay, hold on 1 second. Okay, so we are going to start with Daf 60. We ended off last week with the Mishnah on 59. So if any of you are following in your Gemara, we're going to start at 59 at the bottom at the Mishnah, so that we get an idea of what we're talking about. So the Mishnah on 59 teaches us about the four procedures, the four avodot that were done in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple, and these are the four main parts of a sacrifice, meaning these four works or activities, actions, need to be done in order for the sacrifice to be a kosher sacrifice. So we have what's called shchita. Shchita is the ritual slaughter. We have what's called Kabbalah, that is receiving the blood into a vessel. It looked like a bowl, but with like a pointy bottom. Holacha means to walk from where the animal was slaughtered to the altar. And zrika is placing, either pouring or sprinkling the blood onto the mizbeach, onto the altar. So those four actions need to be done. Interestingly enough, the first one, shchita, the slaughter, can be done by a non-kohen. And we will see this a little bit later on when we're dealing with the Korban Pesach. The other three actions must be done by a kohen, by a priest. So that is going to be a distinction. Now, the Gemara is going to talk about intent for the next, actually, few pages. So I have here a chart for you. This was taken from a website called the Daf Yomi Advancement Forum. So you can see it over there. I have it for you here. But basically, the idea is that obviously, in a perfect world, intent needs to be proper throughout the entire process. As you can see here on top, you have the four processes. Again, shchita, slaughter; Kabbalah, accepting the blood into the bowl; holacha, walking it to the altar; zrika, putting the blood onto the altar, onto the mizbeach. So these are the four actions. And here you're going to see, you can have, this is for regular sacrifices, right? Korbanot, right? Regular sacrifices. And then we're going to see for the Korban Pesach, specifically for the Korban Pesach, there are going to be different rules. Just in terms of the word, again, pasul means not kosher, meaning they messed up the Korban. They need to either start again or, try again somehow. Okay, so I'm going to leave this up just so you can see it, and then I'll go through the daf. So again, we're at the bottom of 59. So the Mishnah here says that you need to have intent. Again, the word in Hebrew is lishma, meaning for it, when the person is doing whatever action is being done. Again, these four actions. When these four actions are being done, you need intent. What happens if you had the wrong intent? So the Gemara says that, or the Mishnah says that it's okay if you had the wrong intent for most sacrifices. However, if it is for a Pesach or for a chatat, meaning a sin offering, those need to have intent. So that is something very unique for the Korban Pesach and for the sin offering. Again, if you're bringing an offering to atone for a sin, it is understandable that you need to have proper intent. And therefore, if for a regular sacrifice, and that's here at the top of the chart, it would still be okay even if you had some sort of wrong intent. Again, but for the Pesach, and that's the second part of this chart, for the Pesach, it is much more complicated. And that's going to take us for at least one or two pages. So, again, for the Pesach, if you had wrong intent or no intent, then it seems to be pasul, again, not a valid sacrifice. What happens if you have split intentions? That will also be invalid. So the Gemara is going to ask, what does that mean, split intentions? Is it that you had, two different intentions during one action, meaning while you were doing shchita, you were thinking about that this is a Pesach, or maybe it's a shlamim? Or is it that it was during the split intention, mean between two separate activities or actions? So we're now at the top of 60, and one second. Done. Okay, so we're now at the top of 60. So again, the Gemara wants to know, are we talking about one action, or maybe it's two actions? And then, again, what does it mean that you had split intention? Does it matter if the intention that was incorrect or improper, if it was the first or the second in the process? So the question, of course, is, do we go by your original intent? Do we go by the end of the action? And the Gemara on 60 really wants to understand: are we talking about, again, one action? Again, either shchita, slaughter, or accepting the blood, or walking it to the altar, or sprinkling the blood. So that is the question. The next question on 60 is, again, we talked about wrong intention, so now we're going to understand, what does it mean, wrong intention? So the first one is, what happens, again, one is that the priest didn't have the intention for it to be a Korban Pesach, meaning for the wrong sacrifice. Another improper intention would be for to have people in mind that were not registered for the sacrifice. As we mentioned, I think last week, there is an idea that for the Korban Pesach, you needed to have what's called a chavura, a group. And that group needed to register before with each other, and then together they would buy the sacrifice, and then they would together eat the sacrifice. So if the priest had in mind for somebody who was not part of that group, that would be problematic. Another wrong intention would be for somebody who cannot eat from the sacrifice. Either they are impure, or they are uncircumcised. An arel is someone who is uncircumcised, and he may not partake in the Korban Pesach. Again, we're going to discuss what happens if he has intention for both, meaning for someone who can eat it and someone who can't eat it. And the question is, would that be okay or not? So the Gemara says actually that would be okay, to have in mind people who can and people who can't eat it. The other idea is, but if the priest had in mind only people who can't eat it, that would be problematic, and then the sacrifice would be invalid. Okay, again, as we mentioned, there's going to be two different types of wrong intentions. What the Gemara calls a change in the sanctity of the sacrifice, what they call in Hebrew shinui kodesh, meaning the sanctity itself has been altered, in the sense that when the priest was dealing with this animal, he was not thinking that it's a Korban Pesach, that it's a sacrifice for the Pesach, but it's a different sacrifice. That is one type of wrong intention. The other one is intention for people who are not either, again, as we mentioned, not able to eat from the sacrifice or were not registered for the sacrifice. And this is problematic. So we're now on Daf 61, and the Gemara talks about, again, if you had the wrong people in mind, that is problematic when you're doing the slaughtering, the shchita, but not in a communal sacrifice. Meaning, in a communal sacrifice, that would be less problematic. Okay, from here we have a new Mishnah on 61, and again, we mentioned this a little bit before, that if the Kohen did the slaughtering of the animal for people who can't eat the sacrifice, so then it is invalid. If he did it for people who can and can't, then it's okay. The Mishnah continues and says that if he slaughtered the animal before midday, before chatzot, that is also invalid. Remember, we said that the time of the Pesach offering is after midday. What if he slaughtered it before the Korban Tamid? Again, the daily sacrifice we mentioned before, and we'll mention again a little bit later. So the Gemara says that's actually okay if he slaughtered it before, but you would need to stir the blood till the blood of the daily sacrifice was put on the altar, and then you can apply the blood of the Pesach offering onto the altar, and that would be okay. The Gemara here adds that a sick person or an old person who can't eat from the sacrifice would make it problematic or maybe make it invalid. Or maybe when we were talking about people who can't eat it, we actually meant people who weren't registered for it. Again, we're going to see this over and over. Okay, what if you had two different actions with two different intents? So you slaughtered it for people who can eat it, but then when you sprinkled the blood, it was for people who can't eat it. So the Gemara actually is, they argue and they say, one opinion is that it's okay. The other opinion is actually that is invalid. Another concept that comes up is the concept of pigul. Pigul is basically the wrong intention, and this intention is if you have intent to eat this sacrifice in the wrong time, meaning there's certain time period in which you can eat your sacrifice. Again, a portion of the sacrifice was put on the altar, and for some sacrifices, a portion of the sacrifice was either consumed by the priests or by the people who brought it, and for a limited amount of time, either 1 day or 2 days. So let's say the person who was doing one of these activities in the temple, if they did it with the intent to eat the sacrifice in the wrong time, meaning in 3 days from now, that invalidates this sacrifice, and that's called pigul. And again, here we saw on the bottom of 61 that if you had this wrong intention about time, even in one part, it still makes the entire sacrifice invalid. Okay, another concept that came up at the bottom of 61 is the fact, and this is something very unique, as I think we know, if you are impure, you cannot go to the temple. Not only that, right, you can't go to the temple and you can't bring a sacrifice. However, interestingly enough, we will learn it later on, but the Gemara mentioned it here on 61. If a majority of the Jewish people are impure on the 14th of Nisan, they were allowed to bring the Pesach offering to the temple, even though they were impure. Again, we'll see this actually on today's daf, meaning in a few daf from now. We'll see why this is, but the idea is that in general it would not be permitted, but if it's a communal impurity, then it is okay. So that is just, I think, very interesting to see at the bottom of 61. Okay, we're moving on to Daf 62. Hold on one second. The Gemara is talking here about the person who is uncircumcised, an arel, and the Gemara actually says maybe he's okay because he's not like other people, because really he can't mess up the sacrifice, because he could get a brit milah, he can get circumcised before Pesach, and then it would be okay. Again, here we use, if you remember, the concept called ho'il, right? Since the uncircumcised person can get a circumcision before Pesach, then he himself does not invalidate the sacrifice. Okay. So the Gemara continues again, talking about what about having intentions for somebody who is pure with somebody who is impure? Again, does that invalidate the sacrifice? And the Gemara says it does not, meaning the sacrifice is still valid. Okay. Again, the uncircumcised person and the impure person can't be part of the group of the chavura that registered for the Pesach offering. Again, here the Gemara then talks about what if the meat itself is impure, or the fats are impure. You can still sprinkle the blood of that sacrifice onto the altar, and therefore, however, if the meat of the Pesach offering is impure, you cannot sprinkle its blood onto the altar. So now we have a Braita, a Tanaitic source, that we're going to learn from Pigul. Again, Pigul is wrong intention about time, as opposed to, again, learning from impurity. As we said, again, because there's an exception with impurity, as I mentioned before, if the entire community or a majority of the community is impure, you can still bring the Korban Pesach, the Pesach offering. Okay, another issue is what if the Pesach animal, the offering, is now more than a year old? It is no longer valid as a Pesach offering. And then what if you do one of these actions, again, with proper intention? So again, you slaughtered it before Pesach, then it would be okay. But if you slaughtered it on the 14th, again, that would be problematic because it is the wrong age. Now, Rabbi Simlai on 62 says, please teach me Sefer Yuchsin. Sefer Yuchsin seems to be a book on, or a commentary on Divrei Hayamim. And Rabbi Yochanan said we don't teach Sefer Yuchsin to people who come from Lod or from Nahardea. Basically, he said, the people from your town, I don't trust them, and I'm not teaching it to you. And then he said, oh, please, please, please. And he said, okay, fine, but I'll teach it to you in 3 months. And then, interestingly enough, especially to the women listening to this shir, we have the mention of Bruria. Again, Bruria, the wife of Rabbi Meir, who was a learned woman, a scholar. She's mentioned numerous times in the Gemara. And he says, hold on, Bruria learned 300 teachings every day, and she didn't learn Sefer Yuchsin in 3 months. How do you think I'm going to be able to do that? So just interesting that Bruria is put on such a high level here. So I thought that was really great. Okay, the Gemara continues and talks about differentiations between, again, improper intent versus, again, intent for the wrong sacrifice versus having intent for the wrong people. So that was, I think, very interesting because they compared the two. Again, we see it as improper intent, but the Gemara sees them as very different, right? Again, if you have the wrong intent about the actual sacrifice, you are changing the in theory, like the whole sacrifice itself, right? If this is supposed to be a Pesach offering, you just called it a shlamim. You've now changed the entire way of looking at the offering, right? But if you had intent, let's say, for somebody who can eat it versus somebody who can't eat it, I didn't inherently change the sacrifice itself. Again, here it seems that the Gemara continues again that maybe it matters in terms of, is it for all four of the actions versus if it's for the wrong person, it's only for shchita, it's only for the improper slaughter and not for other things as well. Okay, the Gemara at the bottom of 62 mentions that Sefer, from the time that Sefer Yuchsin was forgotten, the sages were weakened. There was so much Torah that was lost from it. So again, just an idea about this Sefer Yuchsin. The Gemara continues at the bottom of 62, that says, Acherim said, Acherim here is Rabbi Meir, that again, if you had, proper intent first, and then intent for somebody who can't eat it, then the sacrifice is valid. But if you had improper intent, meaning intent for someone who can't eat it, followed by someone who can eat it, it is invalid. Shlamim is another type of sacrifice. So, you know what, maybe I'll take 1 minute to just kind of give you an overview. I should have made a chart, but I'll give you a quick overview, of sacrifices. One sacrifice, I would say I don't want to say popular, but, the most famous is what's called an olah. An olah is completely burnt on the altar. So the korban tamid, the daily sacrifice that was brought, that is a korban olah. That is put completely on the altar. A shlamim is a korban where, as I mentioned before, part of it is burnt on the altar, but the other part is eaten, a part is eaten by the priests, and a part is eaten by the people who brought the sacrifice. So we're going to learn actually next week about the Korban Chagiga. That was a sacrifice that was brought during a festival, and that festival offering was the private festival offering was eaten again by the people who brought it as well. So that is a shlamim. The Gemara is going to say in a minute that the Korban Pesach, the Pesach offering, is a type of a shlamim, and therefore during the year it would be called a shlamim. On Pesach, it is specifically called a Korban Pesach, which is going to lead us to some issues in a little bit. On to Daf 63. We have a discussion on which part of, again, for slaughtering, for shchita, the person needs to sever two, what's called two simanim, two signs, meaning the trachea, and like the windpipe, and the esophagus. Both of those need to be severed in order for it to be a valid shchita, a valid sacrifice, a valid slaughter. So the Gemara asks, what happens if I had intent for one part, versus intent for the other part? And we say, no, you need to have the same intent from the beginning till the end, and that makes it a valid slaughtering, a valid sacrifice. Interesting here, the Gemara mentions the idea that there's what we think and what we say, right? And the Gemara says that those have to be the same, right? We need to have intent or proper intent and say the proper things, and that will make it a valid sacrifice. again, right, your mouth, your words, and your thoughts need to be equal. Okay. Let us continue. Okay, let's get to the next Mishnah on 63. The next Mishnah says that you can't do the shchita, the slaughtering of the Pesach, if you own or if you have chametz. Right, we're going to discuss what that means in a minute. Again, the verse in the Torah says that you cannot slaughter your Korban Pesach when you have chametz. So we'll see what that means in a minute. Rabbi Yehuda adds, even the tamid, meaning even the daily sacrifice that is going to be slaughtered in the afternoon, must be done when you get rid of all your chametz. Okay, so let's see what that means. So the Gemara says that only if the person, again, who are we talking about? So the Gemara says only if the person doing the shchita, the slaughtering, or the zrika, meaning pouring it onto the altar, if they have chametz, or a person in the group, meaning in the chavura, if they have chametz, then that is problematic. The question is, where is the chametz? So one opinion is it needs to be in the temple, right, in the azara, in the courtyard. Or maybe it's even if you have it at home. What are we learning this from? So the verse says that you slaughter it, right, al mizbechi, right, on my offering, right, meaning there can't be chametz on the offering. So the question is, what does it mean on? Does it mean next to? Or does it mean like, in theory, I have some in my house, and therefore that would be problematic? So the Gemara brings an idea from the Korban Todah. So we didn't mention that one yet. So the Korban Todah is actually brought by someone who is giving thanks. It's of gratitude to Hashem, to God, for saving that person in whatever happened. Meaning, if they, let's say, were saved, if they were imprisoned and they were set free. So that is a Korban Todah. Or if you want, you can bring it anytime you feel thankful to God. What's interesting about the Korban Todah is that it was brought with 40 loaves of bread. Now, it's not really bread because 30 of those loaves are actually like matzah, and 10 of them are leavened. Interestingly, they didn't bring a Korban Todah on Erev Pesach. Those of you who are familiar with the daily prayers, so right before Ashrei, we say Mizmor L'Todah, and that is a prayer that is reminiscent of the Thanksgiving offering, which was brought whenever you wanted, but the only day you don't bring it is the morning of, right, Erev Pesach, because you couldn't possibly eat 40 loaves of bread before Pesach and it's chametz. The other time you don't bring it is Erev Yom Kippur, right? Again, because you're not going to be able to finish all that bread before Yom Kippur. And therefore, interestingly enough, we do not say that daily prayer on those 2 days of the year. So you can remember that when we get closer to Pesach. Okay, but what's the idea? Sorry, I got a little bit off track. But the idea of the Korban Todah is that when you slaughter the animal that you're bringing as Thanksgiving, the bread needs to be in the temple area in order to become sanctified. So the Gemara here says, again, that the bread, if it's outside of the walls, either of Jerusalem or of the temple, then it does not become sanctified. So we see again, maybe the word al means really next to. And therefore, if you brought your sandwich with you when you went to bring the Pesach offering, that would be problematic. But if you left it at home, it might be okay. The next idea that the Gemara raises is the concept of, in Hebrew it's called hatra'ah safek. When a person is doing the wrong action, the Torah tells us that the person needs to be warned. And only after the person is warned, then the person can be punished for their action. So the question is, what if I can't warn them in a proper way? What does that mean? How can I warn somebody if I don't know if he has chametz, right? I can't say, oh, make sure you don't have chametz, but I don't know if the person has chametz in their house, and therefore it would be problematic. So again, we say that the chametz maybe doesn't need to be nearby. Or maybe it does need to be nearby. Okay, the Gemara then adds at the bottom of 63 that maybe anybody who's involved in bringing the sacrifice also can't have chametz in their own house, right? So the person who puts the fats on the altar, or the person who, again, is involved in any one of the actions to make the sacrifice a valid sacrifice. Okay, at the top of 64, the Gemara asks why Rabbi Yehuda added the idea that the korban tamid, the daily sacrifice, also can't be brought if you have chametz at home, right? So he says because it says zivchi, right? Zivchi, my sacrifice. So here the Gemara so zivchi it means my sacrifice, ends with the letter yud, and the Gemara says, well, move one yud to the other word, and then you get zevach zvachai, meaning one offering and many of my offerings. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says that when you bring the Pesach offering, any other korban that's brought that day cannot have chametz. Again, you can't own chametz when you bring that sacrifice. Okay. Again, another concept that came up is the concept of Pesach Sheni, the second Pesach. What is this idea? So this is actually learned in the Torah when the people who were in the desert came to Moshe and said, we are going to be impure on Pesach day, and therefore we are not going to be able to bring this sacrifice. What are we going to do? Because we want to bring it, and it's so special to us. So God actually tells Moshe that we are going to institute basically a second chance. A month later, the people who were tameh, who were impure on Pesach, can bring their korban Pesach on the 15th of, on the 14th of the next month, on Iyar. And this, interestingly, if you don't know, there is a custom on the 15th of Iyar that people actually eat matzah, to commemorate the idea that it is Pesach Sheni. So again, this is like a second chance. Again, this is only for individuals. As I mentioned before, if the community was impure, then they could bring the Korban Pesach. If it was just a minority of the Jewish people at the time, then they would have to wait the 30 days and bring it a month later. Okay, from here we are going to, I think, have a beautiful, a beautiful image of what it was like in the temple on the 14th of Nisan. So I brought you some pictures. Again, these are illustrations. These are made, they were painted for the Temple Institute, Machon HaMikdash. They actually have, maybe I'll show it to you. I actually have their, this is a Mishnah that is illustrated. Here, let me see if I can show you. So it's actually illustrated with all of these pictures on what they did in the time of the temple. So I think it just really brings it to life. You can Google it and see it online as well, the Temple Institute. So here, I'll read the Mishnah and then you can see it in the picture. So again, we're on 64 at the Mishnah. So the Gemara describes that there were 3 groups of people who came on the 14th to bring their Pesach offerings. How did it work? They would fill up the temple courtyard as much as they could. Then they would close the doors. Then they would blow the shofar. Wait, I think I brought you picture. Oh no, I brought you other pictures. So then they would blow the shofar, and the rows of Kohanim, right, the priest, you can see them here, in white. The rows of Kohanim were standing, and you can see here, one row had silver bowls, and the other row had gold bowls. And they wouldn't mix them. And again, they had pointed bottoms. It's not so clear in this picture, but the bottoms weren't flat so that they couldn't put down the bowls, lest the blood would coagulate. Again, you can see here on the floor are the non-priests, right? Anybody who is not a priest, they would slaughter the animal, and then the priest would fill up the bowl. You can see it here. He's filling up the bowl, and then he would pass the bowl down the line, and you can see all the way over here in the background, this is the altar. Just to give you an idea, they are standing in the north of the altar. To the right over here is the inside, is the building, what's called the Kodesh and the Kodashim. That's in here on the right. And we're basically looking south. So we see the altar over here. And these Kohanim, these priests are going to sprinkle the blood onto the altar. Again, the last Kohen is going to throw the blood at the base of the altar. And then the same thing happened in the second group and in the third group. They would also then read, I brought you another picture. Here is, you can see a few things here. Here are the Levites, the Leviim, who are singing and playing instruments. They were singing Hallel while, again, the process was happening. And you can see here they are flaying the animals. Again, sorry for anybody who is vegetarian or vegan. This is not the chapter for you. But again, so we said that they read Hallel during the process. And the Mishnah says that the process was the same during the week as it was on Shabbat, except for washing the floor of the Azara, where the courtyard, where they would plug up there was like a pipe like a drainage pipe. They would plug it up and they would wash the courtyard. And again, there would be these pillars where they would hang the sacrifice on in order to skin it. Again, if there were, you see here that if there were also sticks that they could use, or they can use their arms if they had to as well. Again, the first group on Shabbat would leave and stay on the Temple Mount. The second one, like in between the Temple Mount and the entrance to the courtyard. And the third group would stay in the courtyard. This is all when Erev Pesach was on Shabbat. And then at the dark, when it became dark, they would all leave and roast their Pesach. Again, the Korban Pesach, the innards and some of the fats were placed on the altar. The rest of it is going to be roasted again for all of the people who registered to be part of the offering. Okay, how do we know that there need to be 3 groups of people? Because it says Kahal Adat Yisrael, right? The community or the nation of Israel, but it's basically 3 words that mean a community. Okay, I will get to the raised platforms in a second. I'll get to the raised platforms in a minute. Okay, so first of all, again, we have 3 groups. The 3 groups are a minimum of 30 people each. And then the Gemara goes into a whole discussion. We mentioned that the doors were locked. And the Gemara asks, were the doors locked miraculously? Or were they locked, meaning physically? Did the priests lock the doors? The question is, why does it matter? And the Gemara says, do we rely on miracles? Right? Do we wait for the doors to lock by themselves, or do we lock them ourselves? So interestingly enough, we usually say we do not rely on miracles. The Gemara continues and speaks about the amount of people that came to the courtyard on Erev Pesach, on the Pesach Eve, that they were never ever crushed except for 1 year, and that was called the crushed Passover, because one person was crushed. Otherwise, people were very careful, and they did not hurt each other. The Gemara talks about that there were so many Jews, there were 600,000 pairs of kidneys that were counted 1 year. Just to understand, that's like 1.2 million people were bringing their Korban Pesach. The Gemara says that you cannot mix the gold and silver vessels because of value, we want to keep things consistent. But really, the Gemara says, because it just looks aesthetically pleasing. I'll show you that picture again, right? If all of these are gold and all of these are silver, it just looks prettier. And there is something about the physical beauty in the temple. Again, the priests are all wearing white. We'll talk about them getting dirty in a minute. Okay. What else? Okay. The other concept, Berov Am Hadrat Melech, right? We want to worship God with as many people as possible. There's something very beautiful about doing mitzvot or doing commandments with a lot of people in a community, in a communal setting. So that is something that we see from this as well. Okay, 65. We have the third group, interestingly enough, is being called the lazy group. Interestingly, though, the Gemara says, hold on, you told me that there needs to be 3 groups. So how can you yell at the third group? You need them. So the Gemara says, well, those people should have tried harder and gotten there earlier and been part of group 1 or group 2. And here, of course, I think controversial statement, right? The world needs everything in it. Right? It needs people who make perfume, and it needs people, we would say, who are maybe the garbage collectors. In the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara, it was the tanner. The tanner is seen as a very disgusting, smelly profession. So the Gemara says, look, the world needs all of those people in it, but you should strive to sell perfume because that's nicer. Of course, then the Gemara says, the world needs boys and girls, but, praise be the person who has boys and woe to the person who has girls. So of course, as women, that seems to be slightly, if not very offensive. I did read something, interesting that one can look at it as not that girls are bad, but, they definitely, maybe one can say parents worry more about girls. So you will be spending your time worrying more if you have girls versus boys. I don't know, take it or leave it. It's not so clear. I know nobody really likes that statement, so I'm just going to move on. Okay. Okay. So the Chachamim said that they disapproved when they washed the floor of the courtyard in the temple on Shabbat, either because it's a biblical issue to wash the floor, or even if it is only rabbinic in origin, we don't need to do it, and therefore you shouldn't do it. Okay, the next statement was that, I don't think I mentioned this before, that at the end of the process, they would take a cup of blood from the floor, basically, and pour it onto the altar, lest maybe somebody's sacrifice spilled in the middle of the process and didn't get to the altar. So we want to make sure that it gets there. Here we again have the concept of priests being zealous, right? Zrizim. Here, zealous in the sense of wanting to do the mitzvah as good as possible, as quickly as possible. And the Gemara says, well, maybe because they were doing this very quickly, they might have spilled some blood onto the floor. We have another concept here of what's called, again, dam tamtzit, which is the blood that is generally not put on the altar. This is blood that comes out after the life force blood. What's called dam hanefesh is what we would call the blood that comes out or spurts out in the beginning. That is the blood that needs to be put on the altar. Later on, if something like drips out, that is not valid. And here is Lynn's question. Now the Gemara asks, hold on, if you plug up the pipe that drains out all the blood, then aren't they, right, what's going on? And the Gemara says it was so praiseworthy for the priests to walk in so much blood. It went up to their, and now you can fill in the blanks. Some people say to their ankle, some people say to their knees, but there seems to be a praiseworthy quality to the fact that they were walking in a lot of blood. So now here, you're right. So Lynn is saying, first of all, isn't it dangerous that they would slip? Interestingly enough, they're not moving around so much. As you can see in the picture, they're staying pretty stationary. But what the Gemara does say is that we are actually concerned for their clothing getting dirty. And therefore, the Gemara says that they stood actually on a platform so that their clothing wouldn't get dirty when they were in so much blood. You're right, that is only for the Korban Pesach, because it was an only time where there was so much blood. In general, it was not like that at all. And they would be, again, barefoot. Important to know that when you go to that Temple Mount, you need to be barefoot. Yes. Okay. Next, so with that, and the last thing that the Gemara mentions here is that, when the whole process was finished, they would put the animal on their backs and carry it out of the temple courtyard, again, to roast later that night. And with that, we finish the 5th chapter, and we are now going on to the 6th chapter. So those of you who are not enjoying the discussion about the temple, I'm sorry, you have 3 more chapters. 6, 7, 8, 9. No, 4 more chapters. So sorry about that. But it's going to be fine. So now the question is, what overrides Shabbat, right? Again, we know that on Shabbat we are limited in the actions or activities that we are allowed to do on Shabbat. But what happens when the 14th of Nisan falls out on Shabbat? What are we allowed to do? So the Gemara says you can burn the fat, you can clean out the intestines, you can again slaughter, you can sprinkle the blood. You cannot roast or wash out the animal. Again, this is not, we'll see why in a minute, but it is not, it does not override Shabbat, and you have to wait till after Shabbat. Carrying it or bringing it in from outside the tchum. Again, those of you who have been around for a while and remember Masechet Eruvin, right outside of the 2,000 amot, you're not allowed to carry beyond 2,000 amot of the city limits. So you are not allowed to bring in the animal out from outside the tchum on Shabbat, even though it is Erev Pesach. Again, just a spoiler at the end, we're going to say that anything, basically, you should have done it before, and therefore you should have done it before, and therefore, if you didn't, you may not do it on Shabbat. Okay. Then the Mishnah asks, is there a comparison between something that is biblical in origin to something that is rabbinic in origin, right? Maybe if it's just rabbinic, so it does not override Shabbat. Maybe if it's biblical, again, it's the opposite. If it is biblically forbidden, then maybe it does not override Shabbat. If it is only rabbinically forbidden, maybe it does override Shabbat. The Gemara the Mishnah continues at the top of 66 and says, the verse says that the Pesach offering needs to be brought in its time, bimoado, in its time. And therefore, it is like the process does override Shabbat because it needs to be brought on the 14th. And here we have Rabbi Akiva's general rule that if it can be done before Shabbat, you need to do it before. And if it has to be done on the 14th, then you can do it on Shabbat. And now the Gemara continues that this law was forgotten by the Bnei Betera. This was a group of leaders during the time of the Beit HaMikdash. It's fascinating to see or to think why they forgot this law. They didn't know what happens on the 14th if it falls out on Shabbat. As you mentioned, this year it does fall out on Shabbat. They didn't know what to do. And then they saw a great wise man, Hillel, right, who was there from Bavel, and he was the Shamash, I guess I would say the disciple of Shmaya and of Talion, the great pair of they're called the Zugot. They're basically great scholars, and he basically knew the law. And he says again, the idea that it says bimoado, in its time, means that the tamid also, the daily sacrifice, is also overrides Shabbat, and so too the Pesach offering, and these do override the Shabbat. So they decided to make him the Nasi, like the leader, and they asked him to teach them the laws of Pesach, and unfortunately, I don't want to say he let it get to his head, but he was quite sharp with them. And he said, how do you not know these laws? I can't believe it. And he put them down. So the Gemara says that in the end, he was punished for his haughtiness, and he ended up forgetting a law later on. So the Gemara now says that, again, we said that the olah, the daily sacrifice, needs to be brought even on Shabbat, and therefore it overrides the Shabbat. Therefore, so too, the Pesach offering overrides Shabbat. Again, on Erev Pesach, the Gemara says that they put knives in the wool or the horns of these animals, and then they would carry them to the temple. Now, we know that you're not allowed to carry things on Shabbat. You're not even allowed to let your animals carry things on Shabbat. So the Gemara explains, well, they would only sanctify the animal after they got there. So then it would be okay. Or it wasn't really carrying because it was carrying in a weird way. Okay. And then of course we see that, so now they asked Hillel, right, would this be okay for us to put the knives in the animal? And again, here Hillel says, I don't remember what the law is. And the Gemara here says, you see, that's the punishment for somebody who puts people down for not knowing things. So anybody who is an educator should, I think is obvious, not put down anybody who is less educated or less knowledgeable. So from here, the Gemara says exactly that, right? If a wise person or a prophet is haughty, then they're going to lose their wisdom or their prophecy. And we learn this from Hillel, which we just mentioned, and from Dvorah, the prophetess. She also said, I would say, a haughty statement and lost her prophecy. Also, if he gets angry, right, so then you also lose your prophecy. This is seen from Moshe. When he got upset, he lost his prophecy. So too Elijah is Eliyahu. I don't remember how to say. Do you just say? I think it's Elisha. I don't know how to say that in English. So Elisha as well. Okay. From here, last thing that we're going to discuss is the Pesach and the tamid that can be brought, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this lesson, that if the whole nation is impure, then they can bring these two sacrifices on the 14th of Nisan. They can bring the sacrifice. Yes, Hillel, this is Hillel. Meaning we usually talk about, first of all, we talked about Hillel Hazaken, remember when they knocked on his door? That's this Hillel. And the famous Beit Hillel versus Beit Shammai, that was their study hall. So yes, it's the same Hillel, exactly. Okay, and again, so just to finish up, the last thing on today's daf was the idea that if individuals are impure, then they need to wait for Pesach Sheni. As I mentioned before, they need to wait a month for them to bring the sacrifice. However, if it is the community, I would say the majority. Later on, the Gemara is going to ask, what does that mean? Is it a majority of the nation? Is it a majority of the tribes? It's going to discuss it in great detail. But basically, if it is a large number of people, then you can bring the sacrifice even when the people are impure. Thank you. Alicia is, thank you in English as well. Thank you very much. And as Lynn just mentioned, I want to wish everyone first of all, a Shavua Tov and a Shabbat Shalom and a Tu B'Shvat Sameach. Tomorrow night is Tu B'Shvat, the New Year for the trees, where I see we have at least one Ilana, if not, do we have another one? So for Ilana, we will celebrate the trees for you. And this really is a beautiful holiday that we talk about the beauty of the bounty that we receive from the land, the trees, and as Lynn mentioned as well, right, we talk about man being likened to a tree, where we need to soak up all the water. We talk about Torah being water, and the fruit, again, the fruit is fruit, but the fruit can also be the fruits of our labor, the fruits of our studies, the fruit as in our children, our actions. So there's a lot to be discussed. So I encourage everyone to celebrate, and looking forward to learning with you next week. So have a great week, everyone.